Trying to get this camera at the angle I actually want it. Something like that. Uh, all right. Well, it's great to see everyone here tonight. Still just want to try to get this camera where it's. Come on, camera. There we go. Okay, well, it's so great to see everyone here tonight. So, you might be wondering why you're not seeing any views from the telescope yet. There's actually a really good reason for that. By the way, I'm Matthew Whitehouse. I'm the observatory manager here at the South Carolina State Museum. And tonight we're going to be doing something I've been wanting to do for a while. We are going to take some live pictures of the Orion Nebula. So I've got our big Nikon camera on our big Clark telescope all ready to go, and we're going to be taking a look at the Orion Nebula. And we're going to look at it in a couple of different exposures so we can see a little more of it. Um, and then, if we have time, towards the end, we'll have a look at the moon. The moon is getting a little bit low in the sky right now, but we'll still give it a try, if and see if we can do it. But for now, I actually want to get us set up to take a picture of the Orion Nebula, and I want to try to show you as much of this process as I can. And to do that, I'm going to need to set up a screen share and modify my broadcast just a bit. So give me just a second here. We are going to change layout here. We are going to share a screen. That's the one I want. Okay. And we are going to try to share this in a layout that makes a little bit more sense. That's what I wanted. All right. So if you're looking on at us now, you basically what you see is just a computer desktop. But in the middle of this desktop is actually our camera control software. So we're actually looking at the computer that's driving the camera right now. And I'm going to go ahead and take a picture of the Orion Nebula, and we're going to see what we get here. So it's going to take a 5-second picture. So I'm going to go on and tell it to take the picture here. So here we go. And it's going to take 5 seconds because that's how long I have the exposure set for. All right, very good. And now let's bring up the picture it just took, and we are going to make it full screen. So there you go. There's our picture of the Orion Nebula that we just took live on the air. So what we're actually seeing here is a giant cloud of gas where stars are forming. And so you can think of it as like a star nursery. We're only actually right now seeing the middle part of it or the center part of it. We're going to play with some longer exposure times and we'll be able to see more of it. But basically, all of this that fuzzy purple stuff is the nebula. And then you'll see some stars in the nebula that formed. See, John McCabe says Orion is my favorite constellation. It's one of mine too. So we're looking at this gas cloud here where all that nice purple stuff is where stars are being born. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the Facebook or YouTube comments and we'll get those answered for you. And we're going to hang out on this view of the Orion Nebula for just a few minutes. And then we're going to take a picture at a longer exposure setting and see how that changes our view. So feel free to pop any questions you might have in those comments as we look at the star forming region, the Orion Nebula, look at that gas cloud where stars are forming. Also, those stars inside the gas cloud, especially those ones kind of in a clump right in the center. Those are stars that formed in the nebula, and their ultraviolet light is actually causing the nebula to glow. So it's actually the light and energy from those stars that's ionizing the gas in the nebula and causing the gas to shine. You might also see that the stars have little purple things around them. That's actually not the star at all. That's actually something that our telescope does. Something that telescopes like ours with lenses do. So feel free to ask any questions you might have. I see our Nikon camera system's displaying a message. Let's tell that to go away. and then get back to, here we go. So yeah, feel free to pop any questions you might have in those comments, and I'll just hang out here and see if you have any. Hi from Norway. Hi there, Vladimiro. Great to hear from you. It's got to be the middle of the night over there in Norway. So the Orion Nebula is actually a pretty nearby object. It's about 1,500 light years away. We'll talk more about that in a second. So, Vladimiro, this is our 1926 Alvin Clark refractor. It's a major American telescope builder, so it's a historic telescope. It's got a 12-inch lens, and we're using a Nikon D750 camera. So there's what we were going to talk about. So Brenda, yes, how far away is this? So the Orion Nebula is about 1,500 light years away. It's actually the one of the closest, if not the closest, of one of these major star-forming regions to Earth. And you can actually see it in a pair of binoculars. But what I want you to ask, want us to talk about is, if this nebula is 1,500 light years away, tell me how long you think the light took to get to us. 1,500 light years away, how long did the light take to get to us? And we have John McCabe here asked, when ancient people look at the constellations in the sky, tell us what they thought they were seeing. So it really depends on where we were on the Earth. So the constellations that we typically think of were named by the Greeks. So the Greeks came up with the names. They also came up with the stories behind the constellations. A lot of them are stories from Greek mythology, like Orion the Hunter. He's pursuing Taurus the Bull, which is another constellation in that part of the sky. And then he has his two hunting dogs, Canis Major and Canis Minor. But it's really interesting because there's actually a whole field called cultural astronomy. And cultural astronomy covers what people all around the world have thought about what we see when we look in the night sky. So there are different stories around different parts of the world. Like in the Aborigines in Australia, Orion was actually chasing a group of people across the sky. And he chased them across all of Australia, and then he chased them into the night sky. And so Orion's now in the night sky, and the group of people he's chasing is now the Pleiades star cluster. There's some other really interesting cases of this. Like if we go in the summer sky, there is a constellation called Scorpius. And Scorpius to us is a scorpion. Again, to the Aborigines, I actually did a lot of my graduate school research on Australian Aboriginal astronomy, so that's why I like to reference it. So go to the Aborigines, and some of them think of Scorpius as a crocodile. So different people have different ideas behind the stars, and these are both ancient people and people in our current time. So again, 1,500 light years away. How long do you think it took the light to get from this nebula to our telescope tonight? Yes, Native Americans have some interesting views on the stars. That's actually another group that has some really neat star stories. Um, Actually, some of my favorite, there's a wonderful um, astronomer and cultural astronomer named Annette Lee. She's from the Ojibwe Nation, so way up north in Minnesota, and she's done some amazing work on the night sky knowledge of like the northern North American, like northern United States and southern Canada indigenous groups. So yeah, any takers for how far along the light took to get to us? Or do I have the audience stumped? think we have a stumped audience here. 15 years. Okay. We have Brenda says, I don't know. All right. I don't know is a really awesome answer. I actually really love I don't know. And there's no shame in that at all. It's why we do these programs. So basically, this nebula is 1,500 light years away. A light year is the distance that light travels in 1 year. So that's actually about 6 trillion miles. So if you want to know how many miles it is to this nebula, multiply 1,500 times 6 trillion, and you'll get to deal with a lot of zeros. At any rate, since this nebula is 1,500 light years away, and a light year is the distance that light travels in 1 year, we're actually looking 1,500 years into the past. The light from this nebula took 1,500 years to get to our telescope tonight. So basically, we're seeing this nebula as it was 1,500 years ago right now. You can kind of think of a telescope as not just a spaceship, doesn't just allow you to travel in space, so to speak, but you can also look back in time with a telescope. So here in the observatory, yeah, I meant 1,500 years. Very good. So, like, if we look at a galaxy that's about, let's say, 12 million light years away, we actually have a picture of that galaxy. We're actually looking 12 million years back in time. So, telescopes are time machines. So, what I want to do is I want to take another picture of the Orion Nebula here, and I'm going to increase the exposure time from 5 minutes to, or excuse me, 5 seconds to 10 seconds. So I'm going to make this image go away. We're going to go back to our camera controls here. And we are going to increase our exposure time by changing the shutter speed on the camera to 10 seconds. Then I'm going to click this button right here that says shoot, which is actually going to make the camera take a picture. So here we go. It's going to take 10 seconds for the picture to show up. It's always kind of fun. It always feels so long when we're waiting for the camera to take an exposure. Okay, there we go. Let's bring this one up so you can actually see it. All right. One thing you might be wondering is why we take time exposures in a camera. And actually, when we're looking at things in a telescope in the sky, one of the neat things we can do is we can hold the camera shutter open for a period of time. And that allows light to build up on the camera sensor. Our eyes actually reset themselves. I think it's like every 10th of a second or so. But with a camera, we can hold that shutter open for like 10 seconds, or in some cases, even like 10 minutes. And that allows us to see more light and gather more light and see fainter. So, in this longer exposure view of the Orion Nebula, tell me what you notice that's different. How does this look different from the previous picture that I showed just a few minutes ago? What's changed in this longer exposure view? Give everyone a second to gather their thoughts. So, and I see we have another message coming from our lovely computer. And it went away. Cool. So, yeah, what's different about this view? What do you notice looks a little different about it? I'll give you a hint. Look along the edges. Look further away from the center and look along the edges of the nebula and tell me what you see. Okay, Janice says the light. Yeah, cool. Other ideas. I like it, Janice. Good. Other ideas of what we might be seeing that's different. So Vladimiro says you're getting more of the faint nebula. Okay, cool. Is it a wider view? Stars? Any other ideas out there? So we have increased the exposure time on the camera. And what that means is we're actually seeing more of the faint stuff around the nebula. So more of that faint gas out towards the edge. And so Vladimiro said, we're getting more of the faint nebula. That's exactly what's going on. But then John here said, is it a wider view? So actually, yes, because we are looking at this fainter part of the nebula, we are actually seeing more of the nebula. We're seeing more of the gases out towards the edge. So really, we're seeing more of the faint part of the nebula, and it's a wider view. So yeah, it's really both. You can see how the nebula has all these wisps of gas that extend off towards the edges there. And remember, inside this gas cloud, stars are forming. It's a star nursery. So lots of baby stars in there. You really actually can't see them in our type of telescope. We need a very special type of telescope called an infrared telescope to see inside a nebula and see the stars forming. And there's actually a telescope that's been in the news a lot. That is an infrared telescope that launched back on Christmas Day, and it's now at its destination. And this is the James Webb Space Telescope. The James Webb Space Telescope sees in light that's redder than what our eyes can see, infrared light. And this is the type of light we need to actually look inside one of these nebulas to actually see into that gas and dust where the stars are forming. So if you just joined us, feel free to ask any questions you might have in the Facebook or YouTube comments. And I'll be quiet for just a minute and I'll see if there are any questions out there. I've been asking you all a bunch of questions, so I want to make sure that you all have a chance to ask your questions if you're out there in the audience. That is correct. Yes. So Vladimir is asking, are we going to stack? So what that means is often when astronomers are taking images of things in the sky, especially fainter things like nebulae and galaxies, is they'll take a large number of images and then they will add them together. It's called stacking. And when you stack images, you end up with an image that can be clearer and sharper, and you can see more detail and more faint stuff. We actually could stack, but it's not something that we could do on an online program like this. We would actually have to take all of the images and then stack them all together and run them through image processing software and then show you the results in a program like this. So it's just there's a lot that goes into that, and it's actually a bunch of time, and it's sort of boring to watch an astronomer taking a whole bunch of images and stacking them. So we don't do that as part of this type of program, just because it's sort of this sort of tedious process to make stacking happen. Gives great results, but the process of it's kind of like nail biting. What other questions do folks have? While we're thinking about questions, I'm actually going to take another picture of the nebula here. I am going, and I see your question. Tell us more about Orion. Very good. Get to that in just a sec. What I'm going to do right now, if I can find my camera controls here, is I'm actually going to turn up the sensitivity on the camera. So we're going to keep the exposure time the same, but we're going to turn out what's called the ISO number. And I'm actually going to max it out. We're going to go about as high as this camera can go and take another picture. So here we go. Again, a 10-second exposure. So the camera's taking the picture right now. So yeah, these are not video views, but it is just about as live as you can get with a still image camera. So let's bring this up here. Let me make sure we've got this where you can see it. Sure, this is coming through for you. Well, it would help if I maximized it, wouldn't it? There we go. That's better. So, tell us more about Orion. So, Orion is one of our major winter constellations, and it's one of the brightest constellations. So, it really is a very distinctive, easy to pick out constellation because its shape is so distinctive and because it's got a lot of bright stars in it. There are two really bright stars that we talk about a lot in Orion. There's a star called Rigel, which is down in the bottom right. That is a blue supergiant star. It's much, much bigger and much hotter than the sun. It's also younger than the sun. And then there's another star up in the upper left called Betelgeuse. Sometimes this star goes by the name Betelgeuse or even Betelgeuse. If I say Betelgeuse 3 times fast, you know it will happen. Any of you have seen that movie. So the pronunciations of that star do vary. But Betelgeuse is interesting because it's called a red supergiant. It's a much larger star than the sun, but it's much cooler than the sun. And it's also near the end of its life. So at some point, probably in the next 100,000 years, Betelgeuse is going to blow up as a supernova. Now, when it does, it will be the brightest thing in our sky so far, by far. We'll actually probably be able to see it in the daytime, but it's not close enough to us to like cause us any harm here on the Earth. It would just be an absolutely spectacular show. It would be, I think it'd be so cool if Betelgeuse went supernova, but it could happen tomorrow night. It could happen 90,000 years from now. So don't hold your breath. The other thing that Orion has are those three belt stars. Those belt stars are also blue supergiant stars. They're really, really bright and much hotter and brighter than the sun and larger. Um, and the other thing about Orion is this nebula is actually not the only type of object like this in Orion. Orion actually, there's a lot of gas in our Milky Way galaxy that's kind of located in that constellation Orion. So if we take pictures of Orion with like a really big telescope under dark skies and kind of scan along it, we see that there are a lot of other areas where you have nebulas as well. There's a very famous nebula called the Horsehead Nebula, which actually does look like a horse head, but it's definitely a fainter object and hard to see unless you're under dark skies. Jennifer asked, can you see the Orion Nebula with a backyard telescope? The answer is yes. The Orion Nebula is actually a pretty bright object for a nebula, um, and it looks very nice in a backyard telescope, even a small one. And it also, you can see it in binoculars. The biggest thing you'll notice with seeing the Orion Nebula in a smaller telescope is you won't see the colors. You'll see the stars and you'll see that gas cloud, but to your eye it'll look kind of like a grayish or maybe grayish with a slight green tint to it. You won't see all the colors um, like you see with the camera. We actually need to take a longer exposure with the camera before we can see the colors. But yep, the Orion Nebula is a great object to look at with a small telescope. Absolutely. Ah, there are questions out there. What constellation is it close to? So the Orion Nebula is actually in the constellation Orion. It's actually kind of in the lower part of Orion, so you've got the 3 belt stars, and then underneath those stars is, 3 stars in kind of a little row that are quite a bit fainter. Those make up the sword of Orion, and the middle star in the sword actually isn't a star. It looks like a star with your eye if you're under a very dark sky, but when you look at it with binoculars or a telescope, you discover that this star, so to speak, actually blossoms into this nebula. So yeah, if it's in the constellation Orion, kind of in the southern half of the constellation, at least from our view here in Columbia. One thing I'll tell you that's kind of fun is we're used to our view of Orion um, and seeing it kind of right side up. But if you go to the southern hemisphere, so if you go to somewhere like Australia, Orion is actually standing on his head. He is upside down. It kind of throws you for a loop the first time you see it. It's like, what? That's clearly Orion, but he's upside down on his head. What the heck's going on here? Yeah, we spent many nights staring at Orion. Yeah, it's just a really cool constellation to look at because it's so bright and so easy to pick out. It's also a very big constellation on the sky, and it's really distinctive. So it's a really cool constellation to have a look at. This is M42? Yes, this is Vladimir, indeed. So we should talk about what that means. So M stands for a French astronomer named Charles Messier. Charles Messier's thing in astronomy was scanning the skies. He was looking for comets. So he was based in Paris, and he'd take his telescope and he'd scan around the skies looking for these fuzzy things and that were comets. He really wanted to discover comets. But when he scanned the sky for comets, he kept running into these other fuzzy things. And this nebula happens to be one of them. Problem is that if you're scanning the sky looking for comets, these other fuzzy things are going to distract you because you're going to think they're comets. So they would stop distracting Messier. What he did was he made a list of these objects. There are 110 of them. This nebula is number 42. Some of the other famous like nebulae and galaxies and star clusters are on this list too. Like the Andromeda galaxy is M31, for example. That galaxy where a few years ago that incredible first picture of the black hole came from, that is M87. But what's funny about Messier is that he is actually not really remembered for his comet discoveries. He is remembered for his list of nuisance objects. That is his legacy to astronomy. It is his list of objects that distracted him from his comet searching. So, yep, they were nuisance objects. Kind of funny. Well, let's take one more picture of the Orion Nebula just so we get a little bit more perspective. We're really going to push the limit here. And we're going to take a 15-second exposure. I'll tell you why that's pushing the limit in just a second. So we're going to increase our exposure time to 15 seconds. Click shoot. Now we have to wait while the camera takes its pick. You're learning what it's like to be an astronomer. You know what astronomers at telescopes spend a lot of their times doing? Waiting for their exposures to come through. And they might be listening to music while they're waiting for their exposures to come through. They might be snacking or drinking something warm. It's actually very much being in a telescope can be kind of like not so fun. All right. So here's what we got. let's tell me what you think of this picture. Something's a little weird about it, isn't it? So the nebula looks really, really washed out. And that's actually what we're seeing is the light pollution from Columbia. That's actually Columbia City lights there in that view. I'm going to see if we can get a 15-second exposure, but I'm going to change the ISO setting. And let's see if that actually allows us to see something a little more. That's light pollution for you right there. So let's actually turn our ISO way down. We're going to go to like 3200 here. Let's see what we get. Another 15-second exposure. And we wait. Actually, did you listen to me? Is my camera not listening to me? Let me. Okay. I think it is. There's the image, just came in. Oh, it looks weird still. Let's see. The next thing I think is maybe the dome is in the way. So I'm going to go look at the observatory, and see if we don't have that dome in the way. All right, let's give this another try here. The dome actually was in the way, so I rotated it. So let's see what we get now. Another 15-second exposure. This is another part of what taking pictures with a telescope is like. You get some pictures that are junk. This is part of the fun. There we go. That looks better. So now I'm going to, first of all, let me go back to one of the pictures that look really weird. So this one right here. So I said this was actually light pollution from Columbia. It actually turns out that I was wrong there. It's actually what we're doing here is we're basically taking a picture of the dome. So that's basically, we're taking a picture of a little bit of the nebula, but mostly the dome of the observatory. And same here. Like, that's mostly the dome blocking out our light from the nebula. So I'm going to kick our ISO back up really high here. And let's see if we can get a nice unobstructed long exposure view and see how that turns out for us. So you can tell your friends, oh, on the telescope live stream from the South Carolina State Museum, that Matthew guy took a picture of the dome. What was he thinking? All right, let's pull this up. Ooh, there we go. That's what we want. So let's see, what are we sharing? Oh, now look at the nebula. So we have a 15-second exposure. We've really turned up the sensitivity of the camera, and we are now really seeing the edge of the nebula. Vladimiro asked, what Bortle are you in? So what that refers to is there's something called the Bortle scale. And the Bortle scale refers to how much light pollution is in the sky. So like a Bortle 1 sky is really, really super dark. And then there's a Bortle, I can't remember what it ends up as, but they're numbers that correspond to like a suburban sky. And then a completely urban sky. We are in the middle of Columbia, South Carolina, which means we have a lot of light pollution. We are basically, it would be considered an urban sky on the Bortle scale. I can't remember what that is. So that, yeah, we're under a very heavily light polluted sky here. It's actually pretty impressive, I think, that we can take these kinds of images with this telescope and this camera combination, even with light pollution. Now I actually can tell you what light pollution looks like, because can you see how the image is sort of lit up, like the background kind of has a glow to it? That's actually lights from the city of Columbia. So that really intense glow, that was like a telescope taking a picture of the dome. But that sort of diffuse glow around the nebulas, it sort of looks a little bit pinkish orangish. That's actually the light pollution from Columbia. That's Columbia City street lights and billboard lights and building lights and all of that, all getting washed up into the sky. But yeah, now that we've really turned the camera up, we can see a lot of the nebula. You can also see that there's a star down towards the bottom of the picture that's got some fuzz around it. That's actually another nebula right next to the Orion Nebula. I believe that's M43. So it's number 43 on Messier's list. It's a next door neighbor to the Orion Nebula. And now that we have the camera turned up a lot, we can actually see that nebula a little bit. So I'm going to pause again to see if anyone has any questions. All right. I'm going to check our telescope control software. So to do this, I'm actually going to stop this screen share here. What is the furthest object that you've captured with this telescope? We've actually seen galaxies outside the Milky Way. I think the most distant galaxy we've seen is about 55 million light years away. The thing is that if we'd move this telescope under a very dark sky, say under a sky on a mountaintop in New Mexico or something like that, you're out in the desert, you're high up, there are not any cities nearby, we could actually see fainter and more distant objects with this same telescope. So I'm going to turn off this screen share. And I am going to try to show you our telescope control software here. Let's see if I can share that. Here we go. Let's bring that up for you. So this is actually the program that drives the telescope. And yeah, so the Horsehead Nebula is up closer to the belt of Orion, if I remember correctly. So this is the software that drives the telescope. And you see on the right, there's a star map. You can see that red target kind of in the middle where it says M42. That's actually where the Orion Nebula is. Thank you, John. Thanks for joining us tonight. Great to see you. So that's the Orion Nebula. I'm going to just click on the moon and see how things are looking. I want to see how high the moon is in the sky. Let's see here. Moon altitude is 30 degrees. Okay. I think, can get the moon, but it's going to be pushing things a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually bring back up our picture of Orion so you can have something really pretty to look at. And then I'm going to go disconnect the camera and I'm going to move the telescope to the moon. And we're going to see if we can get a picture of the moon. This might work, it might not. So we'll find out here. So let me turn that screen share off. get our picture of the Orion Nebula back so you can have something really cool to look at, because this is going to take me a few minutes to uh, to make this move happen. So let's bring this up here. All right. There we go. So I'm actually going to make myself go away here. And I'm going to see, let's see, can I make the image big here? Ah, there's what we want. So I'm going to make the image big so you really can look at it. I'm going to mute and stop my camera. And then I've got to go actually disconnect a cable on the camera so the cable doesn't tangle around the telescope, and then move the telescope over to the moon. So we're going to see if we can make this work here. Be an experiment. So here we go. I'm going to jump off for a minute and we'll see you back. All right, well, I'm back, and look what I found. We have a picture of the moon here. Now, I have the telescope aimed so we can see something kind of special on the moon. First of all, let's see if I can get rid of that red rectangle. That is actually something our camera software does. So let's just see if we can just drag that out of the way. Go down there to the corner. There we go. Getting to see us drive our telescope and camera in real time tonight. So I've got everything set up where we can see something that's a little bit subtle and hard to see. So down at the bottom of the screen, you see the moon. You see it lit up with some craters and some of those lava flows a little bit. But do you see that there's a very, very faint glow coming from the part of the moon that's not lit up? So the best way to see that is if you look at that sort of right edge of the moon where it kind of dwindles down just into a little bit of a point of light. If you look like right above it, you'll see that you can see uh, the rest of the moon very, very faintly illuminated. See if you can spot that. It's not easy to see. See if you can spot that. If you can, let me know in the comments. So again, look to the right edge and then just above the right edge. And if you look really closely, see if you can notice that the rest of the moon is just really faintly lit. It's like it doesn't look like it's glowing. It's like, oh, I can see something, there's something there above the sky background. So it's really subtle. Anyone see that? Yeah, it's going to be a challenge to see that, especially if you're watching on your phone. But it's actually something to watch for. Have you ever gone out and looked at the moon, especially when it's a crescent, and you notice, oh, it looks like a full circle? I see the lit part of the moon, but then I can see the rest of it. It's sort of like just very faintly lit up. It's like I can see the whole moon, but most of it's really dark. This is actually something called Earthshine, and that's something to watch for when we have a crescent moon. What's actually happening is both the moon and the Earth shine because they reflect light from the sun. But what happens is that the light from the Earth, that's of course from the sun, actually will go and reflect off the moon and back at us here on the Earth, and it makes that unlit part of the moon glow with this really, really faint light. I actually think it's really pretty. But again, quite difficult to see in this view. I can see it, but that's because I know exactly what to look for and where to look. So once again, any questions about what you're seeing here? The other thing we can do is drive the telescope around. So let's see if I can drive the telescope around a bit and look at a different part of the moon. So let's see. We're going to go real slowly here. See how the moon is moving? It's actually, well, the moon is moving, but the particular motion you're seeing right now, that sort of slow motion, actually caused by me moving the telescope in tiny increments. Got these little arrow keys here on my control software that I can use to just drive the telescope around just a little bit here. I want to try to get it where we can see the other side of the moon. One of the things about our big telescope is our big telescope has what we call a relatively narrow field of view. So field of view is just how much of the sky a telescope can see. And the field of view on our Clark is pretty narrow. And that means that we actually can't fit the entire moon in the Clark. We actually need to move the Clark around to see the moon. And it's kind of fun because it's like we're driving or flying over the surface of the moon in a spacecraft is kind of how it feels. So now we're starting to see that other end of the moon. Now I'm going to move the telescope a little more so we can see the craters. What's happening is that this is a very sensitive camera we're using, and the moon is actually a really bright object. And part of the picture of the moon is actually kind of drowning out the camera because it's just so sensitive, and the moon is so bright here. So I'm going to try to cut that down a little bit and get us where we're seeing just the edge of the moon. Continuing to make these little tiny motions of the telescope here. There we go. Now I can really start to see some of those craters along the edge there. Jeff Will asks, who figured out what first figured out what causes Earthshine? I don't know. Certainly, it's something that has been known and seen since antiquity, but I don't know if there's like a particular person who discovered or described Earthshine for the first time. That could very well be Jeff Galileo, yes. So we're getting close to the end of our time here. I just want to let you know that we have another one of these live streams coming up. Let me just look at my calendar here, make sure I get the dates right. So yep, these are the first and third Saturdays of the month. So the next one will be on February the 19th. And then we're going to do another one of these live streams on March 5th. That's the first Saturday of March. But then once we get into March, we hit the daylight saving time switch. And when we go on to daylight saving time, what ends up happening, of course, is it gets darker a lot later. So because of staffing here at the museum and needing to make sure we're covering everything we need to cover, we're actually going to pause these live streams for a while we go through the brighter part of the year. Now, one of the things to know is we're starting to get in-person observatory events back online. We're doing it slowly, but there is a lunar eclipse on May 15th, and the museum will be open that night from 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. Let me say that again, 10 p.m. on May 15th, overnight to 1 a.m. on May 16th. So 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. that night, and we'll be open looking at the eclipse. So we're starting to get some in-person viewing back here at the observatory. So I see Anita said hi right here at the very end. So I'm going to say bye to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope you enjoyed our view of the Orion Nebula and the moon. And have a wonderful evening, and stay safe and well out there. And we'll see you on the 19th or at the museum. So bye, everyone.